Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on painting and weathering track, which I presented at the Railway Modelers Meet of BC in May of 2023. I have received numerous requests for this particular clinic, so if you are looking for tips on how to paint and weather your track, this tutorial is for you. There are quite a few videos out there on painting and weathering track. In this video, I will share with you my method, which I used for a short section of track, which was going inside the wall between the two rooms housing my layout. I'm fairly new at this, and I'm always looking to learn and improve, so these methods are still in development. When I get around to painting, ballasting, and weathering track on the visible portion of my layout, I'll prepare a more in-depth how-to video, as this seems to be a popular topic. At the meet in 2023, the clinics were asked to address several thematic questions. The first was, what is your next opportunity for growth? For me, the two big ones coming up are going to be backdrop painting and scenery. But before I can tackle those, I need to paint, ballast, and weather the track. The second question was, where are you at on the learning curve? Well, on the topic of the track, I have conducted a fair amount of research, but I've yet to attempt painting, ballasting, and weathering track. What is the next thing that I wish to tackle? I want to get all the track painted prior to starting on the scenic base on the layout. And then after finishing the scenic base, I want to get the track ballasted and weathered. How will I do it? Well, very carefully, as the track on my layout is already in place and the layout is in an apartment bedroom. How will I know what I know, and if not, where will I get it? I've watched many tutorial videos and I've absorbed combined techniques from several. Ultimately, the know-how is obtained by trying different methods and refining them. Now, my hand on this was forced when working on a section of track to go inside a wall, and this would remain partially visible after installation. So it was necessary to paint the track, apply the scenic base, and then ballast and weather the track prior to installation. So this short section of track became the test bed for developing my own methods to use later on for the entire layout. Let's look at the prototype. And when we look at it, what do we see? Now, of course, that depends on the prototype we're modeling, and the track we wish to model can look quite different based on the location, the era, the type of track, its role, for example, main line, siding, spur, industrial track, and so on. But some questions to think about. Is the ballast a uniform color? Are the ties all the same color? Are the tie plates a different color from the other elements of the track? What color is the web of the rail? And how do the ballast and the scenery interface with each other? The answers to these questions can assist us in developing our methods for painting, scenicking, ballasting, and weathering track. Let's take a closer look. And we see subtle variations in color of the ballast, the tie plates, the ties, and the rail. To me, this suggests that a multi-layered approach to painting and weathering track is going to be needed. We are not going to achieve this look with one or two color applications. Ultimately, we want to capture texture and variation. When we look at the model for our track, what do we see? And again, this depends on the type of track we're using. The model can look quite different depending on whether it's a sectional track, flex track, hand laid, and so on. But some things to note: what color are the ties? What color are the tie plates? What color is the web of the rail? How much physical texture is there? What are the main differences from the prototype? As we can see here, most commercially available track is a single color for the ties and the tie plates and so on, and then of course we have the rail. Now let's look at our ballast. What do we see? What color is it? Is there any variation in the color? Any variation in the size? How much physical texture is there? Is the ballast an appropriate size for our scale? So now we'll look at my approach for approaching the prototype in appearance. And again, this is a method that's in development. So what I worked out from my observations was the sequence for painting, scenicking, ballasting, and weathering track needed to be as follows. The track needs to be painted first, and I need a method for painting track that's already been installed on the layout. Next, the scenic base needs to be applied, colored, and covered prior to ballasting. And then the ballast needs to be applied prior to the scenic texturing and detailing and so on. The variation in texture and color requires a multi-layered approach to painting. Several different colors will be required to achieve this. And the painting needs to highlight any indented or raised detail on the ties of our track. Some areas of the layout might require a different treatment. Yard areas are flat and mostly devoid of vegetation near the tracks. The shop tracks and some industrial tracks will require different colors. They might be stained with oil or littered with grain or wood chips, for example. Bridge tracks will require a different treatment to achieve the correct look, and turnouts will require special care and attention during painting and ballasting so that they continue to operate well after they've been painted. My plan is to use trial and error to evaluate and arrive at methods for use on the layout. So I'm going to start with painting several short scrap lengths of flex track for that, and then step up to the section of track that's going inside the wall to trial the full process. My method for painting is a 6-step approach: an initial overcoat of light gray, then an overspray of medium brown, then a dry brush of flat white on the ties, then a thin wash of flat black on the ties. This is followed by hand painting the webs of the rails, and then hand painting all the tie plates. You'll note that 5 of those colors are enamel and 1 of them is acrylic, and this is intentional. I do not want that thin wash of flat black to disturb the other colors, so I make the other colors enamel and I use an acrylic paint for the thin wash. To add the scenic base, I add the plaster and then color it. The initial texturing, such as dirt and ground cover, is then applied before moving on to ballasting. Many people have recommended real crushed rock ballast for improved application and adhesion, so I'm going with that. And refined application methods for greater conformity and control, so using pipettes and syringes to make sure I don't disturb the ballast after I've positioned it. And then finishing it off by cleaning the tops of the rails, the inside web of the rails and the ties, and then continuing with the scenery such as larger vegetation and other details. We'll now look at some tools and supplies. These are for painting the track. So we have the paints, we have the brushes, pipette, syringe, spoon, and a wooden pick for cleaning off the rails afterwards. For adding the scenic base, I use plaster, water, putty knife and a brush, and then acrylic paints, artist's acrylic paints. And then for adding the ground cover, ground foam and real dirt, wetting agent and scenic glue. And for ballasting the track, again, scenic glue and wetting agent, and syringes and brushes for applying the ballast. For applying the glue. And then for finishing off the scenic base, ground foam, tufts of grass, and again, scenic glue. All right, let's get into the method then. I begin with an overspray of light gray. This is to provide a primer coat. The particular shade of gray really doesn't matter. Any light gray will do. This is basically to get an initial layer of paint on the rails. I follow this up with an overspray of medium brown to provide a base color for the ties. I'm using railroad tie brown because I think it matches what I'm seeing in my prototype photographs, but the choice of color will depend on the prototype you're modeling. The next step I used is to dry brush the ties with white to highlight the raised detail on the ties. Now a little bit goes a long way. I remove as much paint as possible from the brush until there's just a little bit left, and very carefully just hit the tops of the ties with that to pick out the raised detail. The next step is to apply a thin wash of acrylic black. This is to highlight the depressions. So that wash will tend to bring out the depressions in the molded ties and not so much anywhere else. This is acrylic paint so that it does not disturb the previous layers of paint that have gone down, all of which are enamel. I then paint the webs of the rails. This is done by hand with a small brush, and an appropriate shade of brown is used. I'm using Flocal Rail Brown for my track. And then I paint the tie plates with a small brush, and I'm using Flocal Rust. This is usually the most weathered portion of track, and those tie plates tend to rust quite quickly, and hitting those really brings out that detail in the track. After each step, I clean the tops of the rails with a wooden block to remove the paint before it has a chance to dry and harden. So at this stage, we've already got color variation and we have some highlighted texture. After the track has been painted, I thought the next step would be to apply the Scenic base adjacent to the roadbed. So I put down the plaster and used my finger to smooth it out a little bit and then let it set. The first step in coloring that plaster base is an initial black wash. So I use water and acrylic black paint, artist acrylic black paint, to again highlight the texture on the plaster. I then color the Scenic base using primary colors such as raw sienna, burnt sienna, raw umber, burnt umber, and that's to achieve some variation in the ground cover. The next step is to apply sifted dirt. This is the initial Scenic ground cover, so that goes down loose. And then we use wet agent and Scenic glue to lock it down. And then we use the same technique for the second ground cover application, which is our ground turf. This all gets fixed in place with Scenic glue. That's a mixture of water and Mod Podge. And we get to the stage where we now have a Scenic base that is adjacent to the roadbed. And this goes down before ballasting because the ballast is going to come down on top of this to some degree. So now that that ground cover's down, we'll move on to ballasting. I begin by applying Scenic glue to the shoulders of the roadbed. That Scenic glue is going to hold the ballast in place on the slope of the shoulder of the roadbed. And I use my fingers to apply ballast to the shoulders of the roadbed. And then I use a small flat brush to apply ballast between the rails and the ties. And I find that my finger is a good tool for smoothing out the level of the ballast and cleaning it off the tops of the ties. Some people use spray bottles to wet down the track and then apply the glue. I find that this can tend to disturb the ballast, so I use syringes for end scale work, and this allows me to apply the wetting agent and the Scenic glue very carefully without disturbing the ballast. Now at this stage we want to make sure that wetting agent soaks all the way down into the ballast, so you can see the ballast changing color as I do this. What we don't want is a crust drying on top and then loose ballast underneath. Over time that'll break up on us. So we want to make sure that the entire ballast is soaked with the wetting agent and the Scenic glue. And here's the Scenic glue going down. I run that needle along the inside of the rails, and that just helps me steady it as I go along. Now, once you've applied the glue, things don't look too pretty. The ballast takes on a very dark color, and there is a temptation to touch it at this stage, and we don't want to do that. Just let the glue do its work, let it dry overnight, and when you come back the next morning, it'll look like this. The color will have lightened, and if we press on the ballast, it should be secure. If it's not, then there's no harm in making a second application of glue to try and get down to those areas that didn't take glue the first time round. Here I'm using a wooden pick to remove ballast from the inside webs of the rails, and that's to prevent any interaction with the wheels of passing trains. I then vacuum up any remaining loose ballast and ground cover. And we now have our ballast applied on top of the initial Scenic base. On to the next stage. I'm now going to weather the ballast, and I'm doing this with Vallejo pigments. I was eager to give these a try, and I've quickly found that a little of this stuff goes a very long way. I'm using black in the middle to represent oil drippings, and I'm using some rust on the outsides where those tie plates are leaching rust down into the ballast. And then it's on to continuing with scenery adjacent to the track. So here I'm applying some self-adhesive grass tufts. Again, this section's going inside the wall, so I'm not going to get too detailed or crazy with it, but I did want to give the illusion of some ground cover in there. And these are the final results. You can see the track, the ballast, the ground cover, and some scenery. So I'm happy with the color variation and the texture at this stage. And this is a closer look, and to my eye that doesn't look too bad at all. So what's ahead for me? Well, definitely more trials, more evaluation, and eventually moving ahead with ballasting the track on the visible portions of the layout. So thank you for looking at this video. I hope it's been helpful for you. If it has, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and I hope to post more tutorial videos in the future. Until then, peace be with you.